Welcome to the Quilt Addicts Anonymous Dimensions Block of the Month. I'm Stephanie Sebbing. I designed this pattern and I'm also the creative force behind Quilt Addicts Anonymous. And I'm really excited about this year's Block of the Month because we are using Kinkame shades from Clothworks. I've been wanting to do something with this line of fabric for a long time because they're ombres. And I love ombres because you see them on the bolt and it's just gorgeous how the colors just change. They go from light to dark and back to dark again. And a lot of times when you see them on the bolt, they're intimidating because what do you do with them? How do they work in a traditional quilt pattern? Well, I designed this pattern so that way all you have to do is cut a strip of fabric and then you're going to be able to get that gradual color change in each block. So for each month when you use this, if you use the suggested fabrics, you're going to have one solid and one Kinkame shade from Clothworks. And you're going to not have to do anything special. You just have to cut your fabric and that color change will happen. And I'm going to show you how to do that in this video. And then we're also going to make block 1 of the Dimensions Block of the Month. Now, if you're new to this, you're going to need a Block of the Month book to follow along with. These are full color pattern books that show you step by step from cutting all the way to your final quilt assembly how to make this quilt. You can get that at shop.quiltaddictsanonymous.com or you can contact your local quilt shop and see if they have it as well. We also have a limited supply of quilt kits for this, so if you want to make sure you get all the fabrics that we are using here, you can go to shop.quiltaddictsanonymous.com and you can get a quilt kit that will have everything you need to make this quilt. Let's get started. All right, so the intimidating part about this is cutting, right? Because how do we get it to work so that all these colors transfer at about the same amount? So I'm using a cut and press because it's really great if you're doing these video tutorials and for any sort of mobile quilting, but you can probably use whatever you have at home. I would suggest you have something that is at least 20 inches in length. This mat goes to 18 inches. 20 inches will allow you to cut all the way to the end of your strip and use everything in there using this method that I'm going to teach you here. So what you want to do is you're going to cut all your strips and then you're going to line them up with an inch line on your cutting mat, whatever you're doing. So I'm lining up the edge of this fabric up with the inch line here. You can kind of just see the white mark below it. And I'm making sure that my selvage is hanging off the edge past that 0-inch mark because we don't want to use that. So now I'm going to take this next one, and because this is a skinnier strip, I'm going to go ahead and I'm just going to set that 2 inches above the other one. So I see this next 2-inch line here. You could put it on the 1 inch if you wanted. I'm going to go ahead and put it on the 2 inch for this one. And what I'm paying attention to is right here. This is where the color change is the most dramatic. So I'm kind of trying to line it up so that that color change is happening at the same spot on this strip and on this strip. And that way, when I'm cutting this, this is going to end up in the same spot on the squares no matter which one I do. So that way we'll have a great, like this one has a fabulous color change. It goes from dark to light in it, and it'll be the same on both sides. So that'll be really cool. And that way it'll look more uniform when you put it together. So if you're doing a lot of these, go ahead and use your regular 6x24 inch ruler. Since I'm just doing a couple for this demonstration, I'm just gonna go with my 6.5 inch square ruler. This is something that you're really gonna use a lot in this block of the month. So if you can, pick one up. If you don't have one, they're really handy, they're really great to use. So since we have everything lined up square on the inch lines on our mat, we now are gonna use the ruler to measure. So what I'm doing is I'm putting my 1/2 inch mark on the 2-inch line here. So here's number 2. So I can see that I'm at 2.5 inches to cut these. So I'm gonna go ahead and give that cut there. So now the next one, since I'm doing 2.5 inch squares, is going up to 5. And so I'm just gonna keep cutting. I'm not moving my strips at all. I'm just lifting up my ruler so that way I don't move these strips around at all. And then I'm laying it down at the next point to cut. Now some of these measurements for the blocks do have like 1/8 of an inch measurements. If that's the case, what I would do is I would write out exactly where you need to cut all the way along the line that you're cutting. That way you don't have to do the math in your head, because the unfortunate part of cutting this way is if you do cut one thing wrong, then all of them are wrong and you have to redo it. So you don't want to have to do that. So just, you know, measure twice, cut once, essentially, in this situation. Okay, so I've gone as far as I can go on this one. If I had a regular ruler, I would cut at 20 as well. I'm not going to do that on this one because the mat doesn't go that far. So what I'm doing now is I'm flipping the entire mat around, and now I'm going to cut at the 0 inch mark so that I have a nice 2.5 inch square to start with. So I'm going to line my ruler up with my 0 inch now. I'm going to trim. And now here's a really key part. When you are lining these up, you want to keep them lined up when you stack them so that it's going from dark to light. And that's going to make it really easy for you to keep everything in line as you're going, because if you keep it in line to start with, then it's going to be a lot easier to remember what's what. It's like these two, and especially these two, it's kind of hard to tell which one's darker. And if you can't tell, then probably nobody who looks at your quilt is going to be able to tell. But if you're really particular like I am, all you need to do is just start stacking those guys up. So that way the darkest part's at the bottom and the lightest part is at the top. And then you just have to keep pulling and picking from that as you go. I'm just going to go ahead and cut these last two so you can see what I mean. Flip that around because this is the lighter end. So now you can see we're easily going from light all the way down to dark. Everything's in order. They're all 2.5 inch squares, and it's super easy and super fast. So now we need to start making the flying geese to go in block 1 now that we've cut all of our pieces. Now if you followed me for any length of time, then you know that I really like to make 4 at a time or no waste flying geese units. Unfortunately, that doesn't work when you're using an ombre fabric because we want that color change to go from top or bottom to top. So what we have to do is we have to do the regular stitch and flip method. But I have a bonus project at the end of the Dimensions Block of the Month book that shows you how to use all those little triangles that we're going to cut off to create an improvisational piece throw pillow that will coordinate with your quilt. So if you are not a scrap saver, go ahead and toss them or give them to somebody who is. But if you like using all that extra fabric, we're going to have a project for you at the end that you can use them all in. All right, so I've chosen this part of the color change to demonstrate because you can really clearly see the dark to the light transformation. So what I'm going to do is figure out which direction this needs to go because I want it to look like this one where it's going from dark to light. So that's really important, is to do that. So you're going to have a pattern book at home that you can use to help make sure everything's going the way it's supposed to. So when it's all done, I need it to look like this in this bottom corner. So I've got my light at top and my dark on bottom, same deal here, light and dark. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to lay that like this, and I'm actually just going to finger press that a little bit. And that'll help me know what direction I need to lay this on in order for it to work. So I'm going to lay that out now, and I can see my little gap, or I can see my little folds from where I finger press that. And I'm now going to do a line. Just going to use my marking tool to mark the line from corner to corner. And if you look at this, it's actually on this side, it's going from the dark is in the center and the light is on the outside. So I have my sewing machine set up to sew in the center because we're not actually sewing a 1/4 inch stitch right now. We're going to be sewing just to the right of that line that we drew. And by sewing just to the right of the line, that really ensures that we have plenty of space to turn that over so that way we don't end up with a flying geese unit that's just a little bit too small. Okay, so before I trim this up, I want to just fold this over and make sure it looks the way it's supposed to, with the dark on the bottom and the light on the top, just like with our sample over here. And it is, that's the way it's supposed to be. So we're going to go ahead and trim that to a 1/4 inch seam. So to trim this, what I'm doing is I'm putting my 1/4 inch line on my ruler right over my stitch line that I sewed. And then I'm just going to trim off this triangle. And again, save these because we're going to have a project on what to do with them at the end. All right, so I'm going to set that seam and then I'm going to press it so that the seam is underneath that wing of that flying geese unit. And if you've done this right, the point should go all the way to the point of that rectangle, and this should be pretty square going around the edges. Now it's time to do the other side. So now I'm lining it up again so that the lighter side is on top because we want the color change to go up. And I'm going to fold this down again so that way when the dark side is in the bottom left, the top is in the top, or the lighter is in the top right, just like over here. And I'm going to get that little finger press so I have a nice guide to work with. Then I'm going to lay that out. And I'm going to take my ruler and I'm going to draw my line to stitch on. And one more time, I'm just going to double check. Yep, that looks right. And again, we have the darker side in the center and the lighter side on the outside. So if you wanted to do this with all of these, you would take just the second half of the ones that are in this color change section of the fabric, and then you would draw all the lines going that way. All right, so for this one again, I'm going to stitch just one needle width to the right of that line that I drew, and to the right, I mean to the right of the end that we're going to cut off. Before I cut anything off, I'm going to double check that everything's going the way it should be, with the darks in one spot and the lights on the other side, and it is. This one's going pretty good. So now I can go ahead and line up the 1/4 inch mark on my ruler on top of that line that I just sewed. And I'm going to save these for that special project at the end. Now I can press this open. I'm going to go ahead and set that seam first. And then I'm going to press that wing to the side with that seam underneath the wing. And again, if you've done this right, it should look pretty square in the corners, and your fabric should be going right to the edge of where that rectangle is. So the biggest challenge people have with flying geese is making sure that all the points end up in the right spot when you sew them together. That's actually pretty easy to make happen. You just need to know where to sew when you're sewing your points together. I'm going to show you how to do that next. So we need to get our flying geese into stacks of 3 like this. And what you need to do is you need to flip them right sides together. And we've got a little bit of, gunk here. The fabric got bunched up a little when it went through, but we're still going to be able to see how this works. So I've turned this to the side so that way you're seeing it the way you would if it was going through your sewing machine. So what you're going to do is you're going to sew your 1/4 inch seam. And then this fabric, the threads make an X when they come together right here. And you are going to sew right to the right of that X, which is going to be a little challenging with this one because it got bunched up a little bit by the feed dogs, but it's still going to work. The idea is if you are just to the right of that X when you sew, then that way your entire point is going to be intact when you sew it together. Whereas if you're right on that X, or if you're definitely to the left of it, then you might lose your point for sure. So I want to make sure to change my seam back to a 1/4 inch stitch because we were sewing with the needle in your center position. So now that I've got that set up, I'm all ready to sew. You can pin this if you want. I generally don't like to pin, so I try to do it as little as possible. Okay, so once I've gotten a couple stitches in, what I'm going to do is I'm going to line up these corners in the back and just put my finger there to hold it. And then I'm going to hold down this center as well. And I can see that that seam was flipping up, so I just paused for a second to change that. And now I'm going real slow as I get to that center, so I can make sure I'm sewing just to the right of that X. So now we can see I've sewn just to the right of where all those threads came together. And now I'm going to go ahead and sew this open. Actually, you can kind of see a little bit better from this side that it did come in just a little bit where that seam allowance was to make sure that my point ended up in the right spot. So now that I've got that pressed, I'm going to go ahead and press that open. And if you look closely, you can see that my point is in the right spot here, so that's great. Okay, so our flying geese are done and they're sewn together. That wasn't so bad, was it? So now we're gonna do the very center of our block. We're making a square and a square. This one's pretty easy, and we're actually doing this again later in the quilt, so once you know how to do it now, you'll know how to do it later too. So this one is a lot easier to do because the fabrics are so dark that you cannot tell what is the darker and what's the lighter. So what I'm going to do here is I'm just going to flip these so that the wrong side is facing up, and I'm going to flip these so that the wrong side is facing up. And I'm going to take my ruler and my marking tool, and I'm going to mark that center line. That may be a little hard to see at home just because this fabric is so dark. If you're having trouble, you can try using like a chalk marking tool. Pink shows up on absolutely everything. So I just want to make sure that I am marking down the center from corner to corner on all of these using the darkest ones that came out of that strip set. Because this is going to be the very center of our block. All right, now I'm going to lay my squares so that my little square is in line with my big square in the corner. I'm just going to start with one, so that way we can do it one at a time here. So I need to move my needle back to the center position. And just like when we were doing those flying geese, I'm going to sew just to the right of that line that we drew. Now to save time, I'm going to go ahead and sew the other really dark one to the other side of this. So again, I'm going to line that up with the corner so that the line that I drew is going from the middle of one side of the block to the middle of the other. You can pin this if you want to. I'm not going to do that. Totally your own personal preference. So now I need to trim this 1/4 inch from the sides of that stitch line that we just did. So I've got a 1/4 inch line right on top of that stitch line. Go ahead and trim my triangle off and save it for later. Now before we sew these other two on, we have to press these open. So I'm just going to set both those seams at the same time. Go ahead and press that open. Same thing over here. All right, now these are going to be next. We're going to go on the other two corners. I'll start with this one first. And now this time, the line that I drew should be going, crossing those seams of your other two little corners that we sewed on. All right, time to do the other side before we trim those. All right, our square within a square is finished and we're ready to put this block together. This center block is oversized because it's the very center of our quilt. We want to make a big impact with it, so we can only see part of it on camera at one time. But I'm going to show you how to put this together. The first part is easy. We're going to sew these centers on. So what we want to do is make sure that we are sewing a 1/4 inch away so that way we don't lose any of our points. So I'm going to start with this one. Just flip that together, right sides together. All right, now we're sewing a 1/4 inch seam, so make sure you put your machine back to that 1/4 inch stitch. And what I'm going to do is I'm just leaving that top pin in long enough to be able to arrange it under the presser foot so that everything doesn't move on me. So I've rolled my machine so that my needle's now down, and that's going to kind of hold everything in place, and I can remove that pin. So I'm just going slow as I go to that corner. I want to sew a nice even 1/4 inch stitch, and if I need to make some adjustments as I go, that's fine. And then as I get to the bottom, I'm going to remove that stitch as well. Now I'm going to wait to press this until I have it on the other side as well, and then I'll just press them all at once and save some time that way. So I always like to lay everything back out to make sure everything's still going in the direction that it should be. It is, we're good in this case. So I'm going to go ahead and flip that right sides together, and I'm going to flip this over so that way my piece side is sticking up. I find it's a lot easier to get everything to go through the feed dogs looking halfway decent if you can get a nice flat side going down than if you had all these seams along the feed dogs. They might get flipped one way or another. All right, let's do one more pin in the center here. Then we'll take it to the sewing machine. All right, so I'm just kind of making sure that as I sew that everything is nice and lined up straight, that my edges are together, and that my presser foot is even with the edge of those pieces of fabric. So when you press, you want to press against the path of least resistance, and it's going to be a lot easier to press with the seams underneath this piece than it is to get all of these seams to go against that way. It just doesn't want to do it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to lay that out nice and flat, grab my iron, and set that seam first, and then press that nice and flat. And my seams are pretty good. I couldn't actually see like the edges of them like we could when we sewed these together, but because I took my time when I put it together, they're all an accurate 1/4 inch from the sides, so that worked out pretty well. If you ever didn't like the way that a seam turned out, you don't have to redo the entire thing. You can just pick from like here to here, make an adjustment, and then move it. All right, so sewing the bottom row together is the exact same process as sewing that one. So what I'm going to show you how to do next is sew that center row. So this one requires a little bit more finagling because we want these points to come and meet at the exact same spot. So the way that I'm going to do that is I need 2 pins. All right, so this is a dressmaker trick. Remember that X where you see where our fabric comes together? Well, I'm going to put my pin right beneath the X this time on the gray side of the flying geese. And then I'm going to put it in the exact same spot on the flying geese below it. Let's get that in there. Then I'm going to kind of line my edges up, make sure they're nice and even, and I'm going to pinch that. I've got my thumb and my pointer finger holding this straight up and down going through the fabric. Now if I, at this point, turn this to pin it, what's going to happen is this top fabric is going to go up and the bottom fabric is going to go down, and your points are not going to be right where they need to be. So I'm taking a second pin, and while I'm pinching this one straight up and down, I'm putting the second pin going in right across where that seam is. So now when I sew this together and I sew just to the right of this X, those points should all be coming together right where they're supposed to be. Let's give this a try. Hold your breath. All right, I'm going to slow down as I come to that X. Remove my pin right at the last minute. Sew the second half of this. see how we did. All right, let's give it a peek. Oh, that is pretty good. It could shift just a little bit, but I'm really happy with this. I'm gonna leave it be exactly how it is. So now let's do that again on the other side. All right, so now we need to press these seams in the opposite direction of the one above. So since in the top one, we pressed that the seams are on the outside squares, this one needs to be pressed on the inner squares, and that'll help us get a real nice join when we put these two rows together. And move this out of the way. Grab the iron, and this time we're gonna press so the seam is going underneath that center seam. And there's a lot of seams coming together here, so you may need to take some extra care and some extra time pressing this to get it nice and flat. So assembling the rows is very similar to when we sewed the sides on to your centerpiece, in that we have to make sure that these points are coming together as close to perfect as possible. Now, if it's not perfect, you just have to ask yourself, am I okay with this? And if you are, leave it. It's totally fine. You know, it doesn't have to be like show quilt worthy perfect if it's just going to be for you or for somebody who doesn't know the difference. You know, don't stress out about it. But if it is going to bother you and you do need it to be like right on, then go ahead and pick those seams and try sewing it one more time or even a second time. It's okay. But that's usually what I ask my students in class. I'm like, is this going to bother you? And if the answer is no, then leave it. You know, quilting is supposed to be fun. You're not supposed to stress yourself out about getting points exactly perfect. Mine aren't perfect. They're close enough. All right, so this is the same deal. We're going to use the two pinning method in order to get these points exactly where they should be. So I'm going to line these guys right sides up. I'm going to put my point of my pin in right underneath where this X is. So I've got my X of thread and my pin is right underneath there. And then I'm going to also put it in right at the tip of my flying geese on the bottom as well. And then I'm going to pinch those together so that this pin is going straight up and down. And actually, I'm going to leave that in place, and I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to pin these guys as well on the sides, because I want to make sure that my fabric is not moving very much after I do this, and that will help me get it better the first time I do it rather than having to pick and seams afterwards because I'm not happy with the way it turned out. All right, so I've got that, so my fabric is going to move less, so that's good. So I've got that sitting straight up and down. I have my seams pinned on the side so that I can remove that pin, and we're going to be good to go. Now since this is such a long seam, I'm going to go ahead and I'm also going to pin at the top here and at the bottom. Get that in there. And I'm going to go ahead and pin in the center too. Sometimes when you're sewing all those flying geese together, they get a little shorter than they're supposed to be. It's nothing that's going to really damage like the overall structural integrity of your finished quilt. But if you're worried about it, then go ahead and just do that and it'll be good to go. All right, so I've got that needle down so that way I can remove that first pin. You don't want to sew over pins if you can avoid it, because that can break your needle and then it can go flying and that gets a little scary. All right, so I'm just keeping making sure my presser foot is in line with the edges of my fabric. Now when I come to the seam, I'm going to sew right up until that needle is fully embedded within the seam allowance on the other side of where my pin is. Only then will I remove my pin, throw it across the table actually, and then that way everything will still stay nice and intact and I don't have to worry about anything coming apart. So when I get to the center, I'm going to slow down, make sure I'm sewing just to the right of where that thread X is. And take extra precaution anytime I'm sewing over any type of seam joint, because that's where you're going to be able to tell if they're off. I just slow down a little bit, it's not a race, and you'll be happy with your results. All right, I'm going to be brave and set this seam before I actually open it up. We'll see how this goes. Oh, not bad. So we've got all our points where they're supposed to be on our flying geese. They're maybe off just like a 32nd of an inch, but who cares? And then this one is pretty as close as it's gonna get. I'm really happy with how that turned out. So I'm gonna go ahead and press that so that the seam is underneath those large squares. And get that as flat as I can be. Then we have to repeat that one more time in order to get the other side sewn on. I'm going to recommend that you do is that you take some Mary Ellen's Best Press. This is a spray starch alternative. I really like it. You can get it at big box stores, your local quilt shop. A lot of places carry it. And what you can do is you can spritz it on. It doesn't flake, it won't damage your fabric, and it will help you press this block really flat. There's a lot of triangles in this quilt, and this will help keep everything nice and secure and flat, so that way when you put your final quilt together, it just is beautiful. So what I'm going to do is spritz this entire block with some Best Press. Then I'm going to take my iron and I'm going to go over all of these seams. I'm not like going crazy all over it because I don't want to warp the block. I just want to help set all those seams in place so that they're really, really flat. Now there's one last thing. Now you've got some leftover triangles that we cut off when we made those flying geese. Now I have an employee who is a scrap saver and she's rubbing off on me. So when I designed this pattern and I realized that we couldn't do the no waste flying geese in order to make it work, that I wanted to give you guys an option for what to do with all these leftover triangles. So what we're going to do is at the very end, we're going to do an improvisational piece, throw pillow, that uses all of your scraps up. So what I suggest you do is that you do this as you go along, because otherwise it's going to be like a million, not really a million, but a lot of triangles to stitch together. So what I'm doing here is I have my machine already set up for the 1/4 inch stitch, and I'm going to move my sewing needle 1 needle width to the right. And for me, that's pressing a button, but check your machine manual to figure out how to do it. And that way I can sew a scant 1/4 inch seam that will allow me to trim things down a little bit better later. So I'm just going to take all of these and then I'm going to line them up with one dark with a background fabric. And I'm just going to feed them through my machine like that. And you can just kind of, when you're finally done with them, just line those guys up and go. And it's a lot easier to do when you just have a few of them at the end of each block than when you have all of them all at once. So you can chain piece those together like that. I'm going to stop here because I'm going to show you guys how to trim those up next. So in order to get this to lay nice and flat, because we're going to have a lot of small pieces, I'm going to press all of these open. So to do that, instead of pressing it the seam from one side or the other, I'm just pressing each seam to the other side. And then I press it again from the front. That way I know I've got a really flat seam to work with. Now we've got to trim these up because they weren't all created equal here. So I'm going to trim these down to 1.5 inches. So I've got my 45-degree line going along that seam edge, and then I have at least the 1/2 inch hanging out on the sides there. Go ahead and give that a little trim here. And you're not taking off a whole lot, but you're going to go from a half square triangle that's kind of oblong to one that's actually square, so that'll make a big difference when you're piecing them all together at the end. Okay, so now we have a nice square. Go ahead and do that with all the rest and save them till the end, and we'll do that pillow. So this is block 1 of the Dimensions block of the month for Quilt Addicts Anonymous. I'm really excited about it. I really just love how these ombre fabrics come together, and you really would never tell by looking at this block that this is just one fabric. We're just cutting across the width of fabric, and we're using squares from that width of fabric to create this beautiful, beautiful block. If someone just looked at it, you might think that you had a super stash of solids, but that's not the case. So it's really cool. I really love the look of this quilt, and I hope that you follow along with us when you do it. You can get the pattern book at shop.quiltaddictsanonymous.com, and we're also going to have a limited supply of kits as well. It'll have all the fabric you need for the background, and then all of the ombres, the Kinkame shades, so that way you can create the same look as we're creating here in the videos. You may also be able to get this at your local quilt shop. Thank you so much for following along. If you enjoyed this video, make sure you hit subscribe so that way you know when all of our new videos come out. And we also have lots of quilting tips and tricks that aren't just about a specific pattern. We teach you everything on how to make a 1/4 inch seam, to how to cut strips using your mat. So if you want another tutorial on how to do that before you cut your strips, you can check that out. And you can learn about all of these over on our blog at quiltaddictsanonymous.com. We have a tutorials page that has every tutorial we've ever done on it. So you can check that out and really use it to enhance your skills. Thanks so much for following along, and until next time, happy quilting.